A royal guard witnessed Kate Middleton's private showdown with Camilla. He recounts every word. James Harrington had spent more than a decade serving as a royal guard at Buckingham Palace. His daily routine was predictable, almost ritualistic. He rose early, donned the ceremonial uniform with its polished buttons and crisp lines, and walked the grand halls and courtyards that had been home to kings and queens for centuries. To an outsider, his life might have seemed dull, filled with marches, salutes, and long hours of standing still. But James knew better. Behind the imposing walls of the palace, history was alive, and secrets quietly unfolded in corridors and rooms where the public rarely ventured. On a mild spring afternoon, James found himself assigned to a routine patrol near the Queen's private quarters. The sun filtered through the tall windows, casting golden patterns on the marble floors. It was the kind of day that made the palace feel almost alive. The faint clatter of staff moving about, the soft rustle of silk gowns from visiting dignitaries, and the distant echo of laughter from the gardens. James had walked these halls hundreds of times, but today something felt different. There was a strange energy in the air, almost like the building itself was holding its breath. As he approached a corner near a discreet corridor, he heard it, faint voices, sharper than normal conversation, carrying a tension that immediately caught his attention. At first, James thought it might be a disagreement among the staff. But as he moved closer, his training told him this was no ordinary conversation. These were the voices of someone from the royal family. His pulse quickened, not out of fear, but out of the rare thrill of witnessing something truly private. He knew instinctively that this was a moment he was not supposed to see, but curiosity rooted him in place. James pressed himself lightly against the wall, careful not to make a sound. The ornate paneling of the corridor muffled his presence, giving him a hidden vantage point. Then he heard her, Kate Middleton, the Duchess of Cambridge. Her voice was calm at first, soft, almost measured, but there was an unmistakable firmness underneath. Every word carried intention, precision. She was speaking not as a public figure to the media, not as a polite guest, but as a woman determined to make a point. The way she framed her sentences, the pauses she used, suggested that she was addressing something delicate, something personal yet important. Across from her, James could make out the voice of Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall. Her tone was more measured, but there was no mistaking the subtle undercurrent of authority and patience. Camilla's voice held the weight of experience, a quiet command honed over years of navigating palace life. She spoke with the kind of calm composure that could contain storms, the kind that had likely diffused countless tensions behind closed doors. James realized immediately that he was witnessing a clash of two formidable personalities, each aware of the stakes but speaking from different perspectives. Though he could not see them directly, James's senses were heightened. The echoes of their words bounced gently off the walls, creating a rhythm to the conversation that was both intimate and intense. It was like standing at the edge of a stage during a private rehearsal. He could hear the drama unfold without ever stepping into the spotlight. He noted subtle pauses, slight shifts in tone, and even the quiet breathing that carried emotions just beneath the surface. To James, every nuance mattered. Every syllable seemed to reveal a layer of the personalities involved, a glimpse into the private lives of women who the world only saw in carefully curated public appearances. As he listened, James reflected on the sheer rarity of the moment. Guards were trained to see, hear, and respond, but never to witness, at least not moments like this. The palace was filled with protocol, rules, and ceremonies designed to keep the monarchy dignified and unshakable. Private disagreements, emotional moments, and candid conversations were kept far from public view. But here, in this quiet corridor, James found himself privy to something that most people would never imagine: a real, unfiltered interaction between two of the most recognized women in the world. James remembered thinking about the courage it must take for someone like Kate to express herself in such a setting. Publicly, she was always poised, elegant, and graceful, never revealing strain or frustration. Yet here, her voice carried honesty, strength, and determination. Even from his hidden position, James could sense the careful balance she maintained, being firm but respectful, assertive but controlled. Every word was deliberate, chosen with precision. This was not a quarrel born of anger. It was a conversation shaped by high stakes, by personal feelings intertwined with royal responsibilities. Camilla's voice, by contrast, had the calm authority of someone who had navigated palace life for decades. She responded without haste, carefully measuring her words, but her calmness did not indicate submission. It was strength under restraint, a reminder that even in disagreement, composure could command respect. James realized that the two women were not simply arguing, they were negotiating, balancing personal convictions with public image, and subtly testing boundaries. The guard felt an unusual sense of reverence. Here, hidden from view, history was unfolding not in the grand halls of ceremony, but in a quiet, human exchange. He could feel the tension in the air like a charged current, not dangerous, but alive, palpable. Each pause, each carefully chosen phrase carried meaning that would resonate beyond the walls of that room. James had seen diplomacy in action before, but never so raw, so unfiltered. As the conversation continued, James noticed a subtle shift in the tone. Kate's voice, firm and measured, occasionally softened at certain points, hinting at vulnerability beneath her determination. Camilla, in response, remained composed but with a hint of concession, acknowledging the points raised without losing authority. The dynamic fascinated James. It was a delicate dance of power, respect, and emotion, unfolding in real time, unseen by the world. He thought about how rare it was for anyone outside the inner circle to witness even a fraction of such moments. Time seemed suspended in that corridor. James lost track of minutes, absorbed in the private drama unfolding just feet away. For him, this was not gossip or idle curiosity. It was a rare lesson in human behavior, diplomacy, and the emotional complexities behind the polished public image of royalty. He imagined the weight these women carried, balancing personal feelings, family expectations, and the relentless scrutiny of the public eye. And yet, even under such pressure, they were capable of engaging in honest, direct dialogue. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James heard footsteps approaching from the other end of the corridor. Someone was coming, likely a member of the staff or a senior aide. The voices quickly diminished, the words clipped and careful once more, as if the moment had been paused rather than ended. James knew instantly that this was his cue to retreat. With a quiet step, he moved back, ensuring he remained unseen, yet carrying with him the vivid impression of what he had witnessed. The echo of their conversation lingered in his mind long after he resumed his patrol. James would later recall this afternoon as one of the most remarkable of his career, not because of ceremony or protocol, but because he had glimpsed the humanity behind the titles. He had heard two women navigating tension, asserting themselves, and balancing the immense pressures of royal life. It was a rare and unforgettable window into private life at the heart of one of the world's most famous families. And while he would never speak openly of what he had heard, the memory stayed with him, a vivid reminder that behind every public figure lies a private world full of challenges, emotions, and quiet strength. By the time James returned to his post, the palace felt different, somehow more alive. The corridors seemed charged with the weight of what had happened, even if no one else could sense it. He straightened his posture, adjusted his hat, and resumed his duties with the calm composure expected of a royal guard. But inside, he carried the extraordinary knowledge of having witnessed a rare and candid moment, A private exchange between Kate Middleton and Camilla, captured in memory, precise in every nuance, and unforgettable in its intensity. After that unforgettable afternoon, James Harrington couldn't shake the image of what he had witnessed. The palace, which had always seemed like a stage for ceremonial grandeur, now felt like a living, breathing organism filled with hidden stories. He went about his duties with the usual precision, saluting, standing guard, and observing the comings and goings of staff and royals alike. But in the quiet moments, when the echo of footsteps and the rustle of curtains filled the hallways, he found his mind drifting back to that conversation between Kate and Camilla. It wasn't just the voices that had captured his attention. It was the tension, the unspoken rules, and the subtle signals each woman used to assert her perspective. James realized that what he had witnessed was more than a disagreement. It was a carefully layered negotiation, conducted with the poise, grace, and intelligence that the public rarely saw. And yet, it was deeply human. He couldn't help but admire the courage it took for Kate to stand her ground, and the quiet strength Camilla displayed in response. These were not simple conversations. They were encounters shaped by decades of expectation, duty, and history. The following days brought a strange mix of normalcy and heightened awareness. James walked the same corridors, greeted the same staff, and performed the same duties, but every corner, every quiet hallway, seemed alive with possibility. He found himself noticing subtle interactions among the royal family and their aides. A glance exchanged between two people, a slight hesitation in speech, or a carefully placed hand on a shoulder. Suddenly, these small gestures carried enormous significance. James knew that palace life was always carefully choreographed, but he had seen what lay beneath the choreography. Real feelings, real disagreements, and real strategies, all carefully managed behind closed doors. One morning, as James stood by a large, arched window overlooking the palace gardens, he saw Kate walking briskly across the courtyard. Her posture was impeccable, her expression calm yet determined. It struck him how much effort it must take to maintain such composure while carrying the weight of public expectation. He remembered the firmness in her voice during that private conversation. Now, seeing her move through the palace grounds, he could imagine the inner strength required to balance personal feelings with public appearance. Every step she took seemed purposeful, measured, and deliberate. James often found himself reflecting on the nature of power and diplomacy within the palace. It was not always the loud, visible gestures that commanded respect. Often, it was the quiet, thoughtful, and strategic words spoken behind closed doors that shaped outcomes. Kate's voice had carried authority, clarity, and honesty. Camilla's voice had balanced that with experience, tact, and calmness. The interaction was a masterclass in subtle negotiation, one that James knew few people outside the royal household would ever witness. As the days went by, James began to notice how this private exchange seemed to influence subsequent interactions. Whenever Kate and Camilla appeared together in meetings or family gatherings, there was a subtle shift in their demeanor. They maintained cordiality, but there was a careful awareness in their posture, a measured tone in conversation, and an unspoken understanding of boundaries. James could see the results of that earlier confrontation in the smallest gestures, a nod here, a patient smile there. It fascinated him how a single, private moment could ripple through daily life, affecting behavior in ways almost invisible to the casual observer. James also noticed the staff and aides walking on a different wavelength. Palace life depended heavily on discretion, loyalty, and observation. Those who served closely with the royals could sense when tension was present, even if it remained unspoken. James realized that the interaction between Kate and Camilla, though brief, had likely set a tone for the days to come. He thought about how every word spoken by those at the top trickled down through the ranks, influencing attitudes, planning, and even the seemingly mundane tasks of daily life. In a place like Buckingham Palace, nothing was ever trivial. One quiet evening, James was stationed near a side entrance when he overheard a conversation between two senior aides. They spoke in hushed tones about upcoming engagements, schedules, and the challenges of managing royal expectations. While their words did not reveal specifics of Kate and Camilla's earlier confrontation, James sensed an undercurrent of awareness and careful diplomacy. Even among the aides, there was recognition that moments of tension between key figures could have a broad impact. This awareness made James feel even more privileged to have witnessed that private exchange firsthand. James found himself thinking often about the personal dimension of royal life. From the outside, the world sees crowns, gowns, and formal appearances. But behind those appearances are real human emotions: worry, pride, frustration, and determination. Kate's firm yet measured approach showed a woman capable of asserting herself while remaining mindful of the delicate balance required by her role. Camilla's composed responses revealed a lifetime of navigating similar challenges with skill and patience. For James, this was a reminder that leadership, influence, and strength often manifest in quiet, controlled, and thoughtful ways rather than loud gestures. There were moments when James felt a strange connection to the scene he had witnessed. He, a humble royal guard, had become an invisible witness to history, seeing a side of life within the palace that few would ever know. The realization filled him with pride but also with a deep sense of responsibility. Every day, he was reminded that discretion was paramount, that the role of a royal guard was not merely ceremonial but essential in protecting the integrity and privacy of the family he served. The memory of that conversation reinforced his understanding of the unseen weight of his duties. One afternoon, James walked past the grand staircase and caught sight of Kate in the drawing room, speaking quietly with Camilla. Though he remained unseen, he noted the subtle gestures: a careful tilt of the head, a deliberate pause before speaking, the graceful positioning of hands. These small, almost imperceptible actions told a story of understanding and mutual recognition. While the earlier confrontation had been intense, it appeared that both women had moved forward with respect and awareness. James was struck by the fact that resolution in the palace was rarely dramatic. It was achieved through measured dialogue, observation, and subtle adjustments, a process that demanded patience and intelligence. James began to reflect on how the public's perception of royalty rarely matched reality. In the media, conflicts might appear sensationalized, with dramatic headlines and exaggerated stories. But what he had witnessed was nuanced, thoughtful, and deeply human. It reminded him that beneath the public image of perfection and poise, there were real people grappling with real challenges, managing relationships with care, and navigating the pressures of public expectation. This understanding gave James a renewed sense of respect for the women he served, not only for their titles, but for their character, intelligence, and emotional resilience. The memory of that private exchange continued to linger in James's mind long after the moment had passed. He found himself recalling specific phrases, the tone of voices, and the subtle shifts in emotion. The experience had left a lasting impression, shaping his perspective on human behavior, leadership, and the quiet power of diplomacy. Every time he walked those corridors, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that he had witnessed something extraordinary, a private, human moment between two of the most recognized women in the world, full of strength, tact, and emotional depth. James realized that palace life was a series of interconnected moments, where every conversation, gesture, and decision could ripple outward, affecting outcomes in ways that were not immediately visible. The interaction between Kate and Camilla had been one such moment. It had been brief, unseen by most, yet it carried the weight of influence, respect, and human connection. For James, understanding this was part of the unseen education of being a royal guard, seeing not just the pomp and ceremony, but the delicate balance of emotion, strategy, and humanity that lay beneath it. Even during ceremonial events, parades, and public appearances, James found himself recalling the private moments he had witnessed. He understood that what people saw on the outside was only part of the story. The real lessons were often behind closed doors, in conversations where stakes were high, emotions were genuine, and every word mattered. These moments required attention, observation, and discretion, qualities that James had honed over years of service, and which were now illuminated by the memory of that particular afternoon. As James continued his duties, he came to appreciate the subtle ways in which Kate and Camilla's personalities complemented each other, despite any tension. Kate's determination and clarity were balanced by Camilla's experience and patience. The private exchange had demonstrated that leadership and influence within the palace were often about listening, understanding, and responding thoughtfully, rather than dominating or controlling. James saw the elegance of this quiet diplomacy, the unspoken respect that underpinned even tense moments, and it left him in awe of the complexities of royal life. By the end of the week, James's reflections on that afternoon had become almost meditative. He saw the palace not just as a building of history, but as a living environment where human relationships, emotions, and decisions played out with subtle power. The memory of Kate and Camilla's conversation stayed with him, a reminder of the humanity behind titles and the quiet strength required to navigate high-pressure situations with grace. He understood that, in this world of protocol and expectation, moments like these, private, intense, and deeply human, were rare treasures, glimpses into the real lives of people the world thought it knew. And so, James Harrington continued his duties with renewed awareness and quiet pride. He moved through the halls with the same precision and discipline, but the memory of that private conversation lingered in his mind, shaping his understanding of palace life, human behavior, and the delicate balance of strength and diplomacy. It was a moment he would never forget, a story without words that had been etched into his memory, a rare and privileged insight into the private world of royalty. James Harrington could not stop thinking about the private conversation between Kate Middleton and Camilla. It had been several days since that moment, but the words, tones, and pauses lingered in his mind. Every time he walked through the palace corridors, he imagined what might be going on behind the closed doors. As a guard, he had learned to observe and understand subtle cues. Every gesture, every glance, and every change in behavior could reveal volumes about the emotions and relationships within the palace. Now, he found himself analyzing the interaction he had witnessed as if it were a lesson in human behavior. It was during one quiet morning, when the palace was unusually still, that James noticed a slight change in the atmosphere. Normally, the staff moved with calm efficiency, the aides coordinated schedules with precision, and the royals appeared composed in all settings. But there was a noticeable tension in the air, subtle yet undeniable. James could hear the faint murmur of conversation in distant corridors, the soft click of shoes on polished floors, and the low hum of activity that suggested more than mere routine. It seemed that the private conversation he had overheard had influenced the mood of the palace in ways that were invisible to outsiders, but very real to those who worked within. James found himself reflecting on the complexity of royal life. Kate and Camilla were public figures, admired and scrutinized by millions around the world. Every smile, every gesture, and every word was analyzed in the media. Yet behind the polished exterior was a private world filled with emotion, concern, and careful negotiation. The conversation he had witnessed had shown him the delicate balance required to manage not only personal feelings, but also public perception. Kate's firmness and Camilla's composed responses had revealed a rare depth of character, something beyond the public's gaze. In his reflections, James remembered the subtle expressions that had accompanied their words. Kate had furrowed her brow slightly at certain points, her voice rising just enough to convey the importance of her message. Camilla had responded with a calm steadiness, her tone measured but firm, signaling that she was listening and considering every point. James realized that these subtle gestures were as powerful as the words themselves. They demonstrated respect, restraint, and understanding, qualities that were essential in a world where appearances and reputation were everything. Over the next few days, James began observing Kate and Camilla more closely during public and private events. He noticed how they interacted with each other and with those around them. There were small gestures, a nod, a brief smile, a patient pause that indicated mutual acknowledgement and respect. Even when the public might have assumed tension or rivalry, James could see that the relationship was more nuanced. There was understanding and cooperation, carefully balanced with personal conviction. The conversation he had overheard had not ended in conflict. It had evolved into a silent agreement, a recognition of shared responsibility and influence. One afternoon, James was stationed near the palace library, a quiet area often used for private meetings and discussions. He caught sight of Kate and Camilla entering the room together, accompanied by a senior aide. From his hidden position, he could see the careful way they positioned themselves, the measured way they spoke, and the deliberate pauses between sentences. It was as if the conversation he had witnessed earlier had set the tone for all future interactions. Both women seemed aware of each other's perspective, ready to assert their own views while maintaining a calm and professional demeanor. James was struck by the level of emotional intelligence displayed, the ability to navigate complex feelings while remaining composed and dignified. James also began to notice the effect of this dynamic on the staff and aides. Palace life required everyone to be alert, adaptable, and sensitive to the moods of those they served. After the private conversation, there seemed to be a heightened awareness among the staff. People moved with more care, listened more attentively, and adjusted their approach based on subtle signals from the royals. James realized that even minor changes in behavior could have a ripple effect, influencing planning, interactions, and the overall atmosphere within the palace. He appreciated the intricate balance required to maintain harmony in such a high-pressure environment. During a quiet moment in the palace gardens, James found himself reflecting on the human side of royalty. Many people admired Kate and Camilla from afar, but few understood the personal challenges they faced. Kate's determination to express her perspective clearly, combined with Camilla's experience and patience, revealed the real work behind the titles. It was a delicate interplay of emotion, strategy, and responsibility. James realized that the power of royalty was not just in ceremonies and public appearances, but in these private, thoughtful moments where decisions were shaped, relationships managed, and mutual respect maintained. James began to think about the long-term impact of that private conversation. In the palace, even brief exchanges could influence relationships for months or years. Kate and Camilla had found a way to communicate openly while maintaining dignity and respect. This was a lesson in leadership, patience, and emotional control, qualities that James admired deeply. He thought about how these skills were applied in public duties, charitable work, and family responsibilities, and how the ability to handle private tensions could ultimately affect the perception of the monarchy itself. One evening, James found himself stationed near a side corridor that led to the private dining area. Through a slightly ajar door, he heard fragments of a conversation between aides, discussing upcoming events and preparations. Though the conversation was mundane on the surface, James could sense a careful consideration of past interactions. The private discussion between Kate and Camilla had subtly guided the planning, the tone, and the approach to upcoming engagements. It was a reminder that palace life was a web of interconnected moments, each influencing the other, and that the dynamics of personal relationships were deeply intertwined with public duties. James also reflected on the courage required to navigate such moments. Speaking honestly and asserting oneself in a private setting, especially within a world as structured as the palace, required a balance of confidence, tact, and awareness. Kate's voice had conveyed clarity and purpose, while Camilla's responses had shown thoughtfulness and experience. James realized that the ability to manage emotions, communicate effectively, and maintain composure under scrutiny was a skill that few could master. Watching this interplay unfold, even from a distance, was both inspiring and educational. In the following days, James observed the continued evolution of their relationship. While moments of tension were natural, there was a growing sense of mutual understanding and collaboration. Kate and Camilla appeared to anticipate each other's perspectives, adjusting their communication to ensure clarity, respect, and shared purpose. James could see how the earlier private conversation had acted as a foundation for this ongoing dynamic. It was a subtle, powerful example of how conflict, when handled thoughtfully, could strengthen relationships rather than weaken them. James also thought about the broader implications for the royal family. Relationships within the palace were complex, influenced by tradition, public expectation, and personal emotion. The way Kate and Camilla managed their interactions set an example for others, demonstrating that honesty, patience, and respect could coexist with strong personal conviction. For James, it was a lesson not only in palace life, but in human behavior more generally. He began to see the value of listening, observing, and understanding before reacting, principles that applied both inside and outside the palace walls. One quiet afternoon, James had a rare moment to reflect while sitting near the grand hall. He thought about the lessons hidden in that private exchange. The strength of Kate's voice, the calm wisdom of Camilla, and the way both women balanced personal feelings with public responsibility. He realized that the true essence of leadership was not in outward displays, but in these moments of thoughtful communication and mutual respect. The ability to navigate disagreement with composure, empathy, and clarity was a skill that could shape outcomes in ways unseen but deeply influential. James also appreciated the subtle beauty of the palace itself, which framed these human interactions. The high ceilings, ornate decorations, and polished floors were more than mere aesthetics. They reflected centuries of history, protocol, and tradition. Within this grand setting, personal moments like the one he had witnessed carried extraordinary weight. James understood that every word spoken, every gesture made, and every decision taken within these walls was part of a larger narrative, one that intertwined the personal with the ceremonial, the emotional with the political. By the end of the week, James found himself more aware than ever of the invisible threads connecting people within the palace. The private conversation between Kate and Camilla had revealed the complexity, intelligence, and humanity behind their public roles. It had shown that even in a world dominated by ceremony and protocol, genuine emotion and careful communication were essential. James carried this understanding with him, quietly observing, learning, and appreciating the rare moments of honesty and insight he had the privilege to witness. Through it all, James felt a deep sense of respect for both women. Kate's courage, clarity, and emotional intelligence had left a lasting impression, as had Camilla's experience, composure, and subtle authority. Their private conversation was more than a moment of tension. It was a masterclass in diplomacy, patience, and understanding. For James, it was a reminder that behind every public figure lies a private world filled with challenges, emotions, and moments of human connection that define character, influence outcomes, and shape relationships. In the days following the private conversation between Kate, Middleton, and Camilla, James Harrington noticed subtle but undeniable changes in the atmosphere of Buckingham Palace. What had seemed like an ordinary week now carried a sense of anticipation and quiet reflection. The palace, which was always alive with activity, seemed to move with a slightly altered rhythm. Guards, aides, and staff all appeared to sense that something important had taken place behind closed doors. James could feel the tension that had once only been audible in voices was now present in gestures, expressions, and the careful way people carried out their duties. James observed Kate and Camilla during several private meetings. Their interactions were calm and composed, yet the memory of their previous conversation seemed to guide their behavior. There was a deliberate attentiveness in Kate's expressions, a precision in her words, and a subtle acknowledgement of Camilla's perspective. Camilla, in turn, maintained her usual poise, speaking thoughtfully and allowing Kate the space to express herself fully. It was a display of emotional intelligence that James found remarkable. He understood that the ability to balance authority, personal conviction, and mutual respect was not something learned overnight, but honed through experience, self-awareness, and a deep understanding of human nature. Even outside formal meetings, the influence of that private discussion was noticeable. During casual interactions with staff, Kate appeared more confident, assertive, yet approachable. She had an air of quiet authority that encouraged cooperation without imposing pressure. Camilla, always composed, seemed to acknowledge Kate's points with subtle gestures, a nod, a patient smile, or a brief pause before responding. It was clear to James that their earlier confrontation had not created a rift, but had led to a mutual understanding and recalibration of their working relationship. The dynamic was delicate, respectful, and effective, demonstrating how private negotiations could influence public conduct. James began paying closer attention to the small details that reflected this shift. In the palace dining room during a morning briefing, Kate and Camilla exchanged brief, meaningful glances. There was no tension, only a subtle recognition of shared responsibility. Staff members observed this with quiet awareness, understanding that these interactions signaled the importance of careful communication. Even minor adjustments in posture or tone could signal agreement, concern, or deference. James realized that the palace operated much like a finely tuned machine, where every action and reaction, no matter how small, contributed to overall harmony and efficiency. During one particularly busy afternoon, James witnessed Kate and Camilla walking side by side through the gardens. Their conversation was low and private, but James could sense a new ease between them. Kate's posture was relaxed yet confident, while Camilla's movements suggested attentiveness and patience. They seemed to have reached a tacit understanding, an unspoken agreement that allowed them to work together while respecting each other's perspectives. James reflected on how unusual it must be to maintain such composure under the scrutiny of both palace staff and the world outside. It required extraordinary self-control, awareness, and emotional intelligence. James also noticed changes in the staff's behavior. Palace aides and assistants appeared more attentive, perhaps sensing that the royals' interactions were evolving in a positive way. Schedules were managed more smoothly, meetings were conducted with greater efficiency, and minor disagreements among staff seemed to resolve more quickly. The ripple effect of the private conversation was apparent in subtle ways, a reminder that in a place like Buckingham Palace, even brief interactions between senior members could influence the overall functioning of the household. James found this both fascinating and instructive, a lesson in leadership, influence, and the power of thoughtful communication. One morning, James was stationed near a side corridor leading to the private study. Through a slightly open door, he glimpsed Kate speaking with a senior aide. Her voice was calm but assertive, conveying clear instructions while remaining considerate of the aide's input. James recalled the firmness in her earlier conversation with Camilla and noticed that the same qualities were evident now. Kate had clearly internalized the lessons from their private discussion: how to assert her perspective while maintaining respect, how to communicate with clarity, and how to navigate sensitive situations without creating unnecessary tension. Camilla, on the other hand, continued to demonstrate her characteristic composure. In meetings James observed from a distance, she spoke with measured precision, acknowledging the points made by Kate and others while offering her own insights thoughtfully. There was a sense of balance in her approach, neither dismissive nor overbearing, but strategically patient. James realized that this combination of firmness and patience was essential in maintaining harmony within the palace. It allowed for honest dialogue while preserving dignity and respect, creating an environment where decisions could be made effectively. The impact of the private conversation was also visible in public events. When Kate and Camilla appeared together at official engagements, their body language suggested mutual awareness and cooperation. They maintained appropriate decorum, yet there was a subtle understanding in their interactions, a recognition that had been forged in private. James observed that these moments of silent coordination helped project a united and composed front, even when personal opinions or differences might have existed. It was a reminder that diplomacy often occurs in the quiet, behind-the-scenes moments, rather than in overt displays. James began to consider the emotional aspect of these developments. He realized that both women had likely invested considerable thought and energy into navigating their private disagreement. Kate's determination to assert her views and Camilla's patience in responding were not signs of stubbornness, but of care, strategy, and mutual respect. The ability to handle disagreement constructively, without letting it spill into public or professional disruption, was a mark of maturity and intelligence. For James, witnessing this process reinforced his admiration for the human qualities underlying the royal roles, qualities that required resilience, tact, and self-awareness. During a quiet evening patrol, James reflected on how the private conversation had influenced the palace environment in broader ways. The sense of calm and balance among staff, the subtle cooperation between Kate and Camilla, and the efficient conduct of duties all pointed to the power of thoughtful dialogue. James realized that leadership was not only about visible authority, but about the ability to communicate effectively, resolve tensions, and foster mutual understanding. The impact of these private negotiations extended far beyond the individuals involved, shaping the atmosphere and operations of the palace as a whole. James also found himself thinking about the long-term significance of this moment. Relationships within the royal family were layered and complex, influenced by tradition, expectation, and personal feelings. A single private conversation could serve as a turning point, creating opportunities for greater cooperation, understanding, and respect. James understood that what he had witnessed was not just a moment of confrontation, but a moment of growth, a step toward stronger relationships, more effective communication, and a more cohesive environment. It was a testament to the quiet power of honesty, patience, and emotional intelligence. Even during ceremonial events, James noticed the influence of that conversation. Kate and Camilla's interactions with each other were measured, composed, and collaborative. They demonstrated the ability to navigate their responsibilities with grace, balancing personal feelings with public duties. Staff and aides, observing this dynamic, were influenced by the tone set by the senior royals. James realized that leadership was as much about subtle cues and thoughtful communication as it was about public appearances and formal authority. The private conversation had created a foundation for continued respect, cooperation, and effective decision-making. James also reflected on the personal qualities that had made this possible. Kate's clarity of thought, determination, and emotional awareness allowed her to express her perspective confidently. Camilla's composure, patience, and strategic understanding allowed her to respond thoughtfully. Together, these qualities created a dynamic that was both effective and respectful, allowing for honest communication without conflict. James recognized that such interactions required both skill and character, the ability to balance self-expression with consideration for others, and the courage to navigate difficult conversations without letting ego or pride dominate. By the end of the week, James had observed a remarkable evolution. What had begun as a tense private conversation had become a foundation for mutual understanding and cooperation. The palace environment reflected this change in subtle ways, in gestures, expressions, tone of voice, and behavior. James felt privileged to witness this transformation, understanding that such moments were rare, delicate, and deeply human. He saw firsthand how private interactions could shape public behavior, influence relationships, and foster an atmosphere of respect and collaboration. James realized that the real power of the conversation lay in its quiet, constructive resolution. It had been an exchange of ideas, concerns, and perspectives, not an argument meant to win or dominate. Kate and Camilla had listened, understood, and responded thoughtfully, demonstrating a level of emotional intelligence and diplomacy that few outside the palace could fully appreciate. For James, it was a lesson in patience, observation, and the subtle ways in which influence and leadership could manifest. In the weeks that followed, James continued to carry the memory of that private conversation with him. He observed the ongoing interactions between Kate and Camilla with a deeper understanding, noticing the small but meaningful ways in which their relationship had evolved. It was a reminder that behind every title, every public appearance, and every ceremonial duty, there were human beings navigating complex emotions, responsibilities, and relationships. For James, the experience had been both an education and a privilege, offering a rare glimpse into the real lives of the royal family. James often reflected on the broader lesson of this experience. He understood that conflict, when approached thoughtfully, could lead to understanding and growth. The private conversation had demonstrated the importance of listening, patience, and clear communication. It had shown that even in high-pressure environments, respectful dialogue could transform tension into collaboration. For James, this was a powerful insight, one that extended beyond the palace walls into the understanding of human behavior in all areas of life. James Harrington had long since grown accustomed to the rhythms of palace life, the steady cadence of footsteps, the quiet hum of preparation, and the subtle signals that passed silently among staff and royals. Yet, even months after witnessing the private conversation between Kate Middleton and Camilla, the memory of that moment remained vivid in his mind. It had been more than just a disagreement. It had been a rare and profound glimpse into the private world of royalty, a world where words carried weight far beyond what outsiders could imagine. As James continued his daily patrols, he noticed how the interaction between Kate and Camilla had left a lasting impression on the atmosphere of the palace. The tension that had once seemed so palpable had transformed into an undercurrent of mutual respect and understanding. Where there might have been hesitation or guarded behavior before, there was now a sense of cooperation and careful alignment. Even when they were not speaking directly, James could see the influence of that private exchange in the way both women carried themselves, how they made eye contact, and how they subtly coordinated their actions in group settings. James often reflected on the uniqueness of the moment. In the public eye, Kate and Camilla were admired figures, surrounded by headlines, media scrutiny, and the constant expectations of millions. Their lives were outwardly composed, graceful, and polished. But what James had witnessed was far more revealing. The human side of royalty, where courage, patience, and emotional intelligence were as essential as protocol and tradition. He saw that private conversations, conducted thoughtfully, could shape relationships, influence behavior, and create opportunities for growth in ways that public appearances never could. It was in quiet, unobserved moments like these that James felt the weight and responsibility of his role. A royal guard's duties extended beyond ceremonial postures and formal duties. They were guardians of privacy, witnesses to history, and silent observers of the personal dynamics that could influence the monarchy's stability. The private conversation between Kate and Camilla had reminded him that life inside the palace was a delicate balance, a mixture of personal conviction, duty, and discretion. Every interaction mattered, and every word spoken could carry unseen consequences. One afternoon, James was stationed near the grand ballroom, watching as Kate and Camilla moved with quiet precision through a group of staff and aides. Their gestures were subtle but telling. A nod here, a patient smile there, a brief, understanding glance exchanged in passing. These small moments reflected the evolution of their relationship, a transformation that had begun with that private, tense conversation. James observed how Kate now seemed even more confident in asserting her perspective, while Camilla continued to guide with experience and calm authority. Together, they had established a rhythm of cooperation that was both effective and graceful. James began to consider the long-term impact of such private interactions. Within the palace, relationships between senior members were central to the smooth functioning of the household. A moment of tension, handled thoughtfully, could strengthen connections, foster understanding, and create a framework for ongoing collaboration. Conversely, unresolved conflict could create friction, misunderstanding, and inefficiency. By witnessing the careful negotiation between Kate and Camilla, James had seen a rare example of how emotional intelligence and strategic communication could shape the very fabric of palace life. In the weeks that followed, James noticed even more subtle changes in behavior. Staff appeared more attentive, not only to their duties but to the needs and preferences of the royals. Meetings ran more smoothly, decisions were made with greater clarity, and even minor disagreements among the household staff seemed to resolve with less effort. The ripple effect of Kate and Camilla's private exchange was evident everywhere. James found it remarkable how a single conversation, conducted with honesty, respect, and composure, could influence an entire ecosystem. It was a lesson in leadership and human behavior that he would carry with him for years to come. James also reflected on the qualities that had made this transformation possible. Kate's clarity, courage, and ability to express herself with honesty had been matched by Camilla's patience, composure, and thoughtful response. The combination of these qualities allowed them to navigate a difficult moment successfully, turning potential conflict into understanding and cooperation. James realized that such moments required not only skill but also character, a willingness to listen, consider other perspectives, and respond with balance and tact. In many ways, it was a microcosm of leadership in action, unfolding in a private setting where the stakes were both personal and public. One quiet evening, as James walked along the palace corridors, he found himself thinking about the emotional depth of the situation. Kate and Camilla had managed to express themselves honestly without diminishing each other's dignity. They had navigated tension with empathy and respect, creating a foundation of understanding that could guide future interactions. James recognized that this was not simply a lesson in etiquette or protocol. It was a lesson in human behavior, one that demonstrated how patience, communication, and mutual respect could resolve even the most delicate of situations. James also considered the role of discretion. What he had witnessed would never be shared publicly, and yet its impact was profound. The power of a private conversation lay not only in the words spoken, but in the trust and confidentiality that allowed genuine expression. James understood that discretion was an essential part of life within the palace. It allowed the royals to navigate personal and professional challenges without the pressure of public scrutiny, creating an environment where honesty and resolution could flourish. As the months passed, James saw the lasting effects of that conversation in both personal and professional settings. Kate and Camilla's interactions had grown smoother, marked by an unspoken understanding and mutual respect. In staff meetings, they projected calm authority and confidence. In private discussions, they listened to each other's points with care and responded thoughtfully. Even in public appearances, the subtle harmony in their behavior reflected the strength of their private rapport. James understood that the palace was a place where such private moments could have far-reaching consequences, shaping both relationships and the efficiency of operations. James often reflected on the lessons he had learned from observing these dynamics. Leadership was not about domination or winning an argument. It was about listening, understanding, and navigating differences with intelligence and care. The ability to manage personal feelings while considering the perspectives of others was essential. Kate and Camilla had demonstrated this skill in a way that was both quiet and powerful, influencing not only their own interactions, but the behavior and attitude of those around them. James realized that true influence often occurred in moments of discretion, subtlety, and empathy, rather than in overt displays of authority. In his quiet reflections, James also thought about the human side of the royals. Behind the polished appearances, there were real emotions, challenges, and vulnerabilities. Kate's strength had been matched by honesty and thoughtfulness. Camilla's patience had been accompanied by understanding and careful judgment. Together, they had shown that even in high-pressure environments, constructive dialogue could foster understanding, resolve tension, and build stronger relationships. For James, witnessing this was a privilege, a reminder that leadership, influence, and emotional intelligence were deeply human qualities that transcended titles and ceremony. James found himself applying these lessons to his own perspective as a royal guard. Observing discretion, patience, and thoughtful communication had sharpened his understanding of human behavior. He recognized the value of listening attentively, understanding the context, and responding thoughtfully in difficult situations. The private exchange between Kate and Camilla had become, in his mind, an example of how even subtle acts of communication could create significant, lasting effects. It was a lesson he would carry with him not only in his professional duties, but in his personal life as well. Even during formal events and ceremonies, James continued to notice the quiet influence of that private moment. Kate and Camilla's interactions projected confidence, composure, and collaboration. Staff and aides responded accordingly, adjusting their actions and communication to align with the tone set by the royals. James realized that this harmony was not accidental. It was the result of careful, thoughtful negotiation, reinforced by mutual respect and understanding. The private conversation had been the catalyst for a transformation that extended far beyond the words spoken that afternoon. Looking back, James saw the private conversation as a turning point, not just in the relationship between Kate and Camilla, but in the overall atmosphere of the palace. It had demonstrated that even in an environment governed by tradition, protocol, and public expectation, honesty, empathy, and clear communication could foster understanding, strengthen relationships, and improve operations. James felt privileged to have witnessed it, knowing that such moments were rare, delicate, and profoundly influential. As the day ended and James resumed his evening patrol, he reflected on the significance of what he had observed. The memory of that private conversation remained vivid, not as a source of gossip or curiosity, but as a lesson in human behavior, diplomacy, and emotional intelligence. He understood that the true power of leadership lay in the ability to navigate differences with grace, respect, and thoughtfulness. Kate and Camilla had demonstrated this power quietly, privately, and effectively, leaving a lasting impression not only on those around them, but on James himself. James Harrington continued his service with renewed awareness and appreciation. Every step along the palace corridors reminded him of the quiet strength required to balance duty, personal feelings, and public expectation. The private conversation had shown him that even behind titles and tradition, real human interaction mattered. It was a lesson in patience, observation, and thoughtful communication, a lesson that extended far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. For James, the memory would remain with him always, a rare glimpse into the private world of royalty, a story of courage, patience, and respect, and a reminder that even in the most structured and formal environments, humanity, understanding, and diplomacy could prevail. It was an experience that had changed his perspective, deepened his understanding, and left him with a profound respect for the quiet strength and intelligence of those he served.